She grabbed the 2-tier wedding cake and smashed it right into the face of a 63-year-old woman in front of 400 guests, including some of the most powerful crime bosses on the entire East Coast. What happened behind closed doors in the back room of that hotel was 100 times more brutal than what anyone in that ballroom ever saw, and what the most ruthless mafia boss in New York did when he finally discovered the truth sent shockwaves through the entire underworld that nobody saw coming. This story of love, betrayal, revenge, and justice from the heart of the criminal underworld will leave you breathless until the very last second. But to understand how everything spiraled into that single moment of pure destruction, we've got to go back a few months. Because this story didn't start with a cake flying through the air. It started with a fake smile, an ice-cold handshake, and the faint smell of gunpowder still lingering in the air on a September night in Manhattan. If you're enjoying this story, go ahead and hit that like button, share it with someone you love, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a video. Now, to truly understand how a woman who'd survived bullets and beatings from rival gangsters nearly lost her own son, not to a gun, but to the smile of a woman he thought he loved, we need to start from the very beginning. Dominic Valente had everything a 36-year-old man could dream of, and plenty of things most ordinary people wouldn't even dare to imagine. He was the head of the Valente family, one of the most powerful organizations in New York, an empire that stretched from the most luxurious Italian restaurants in Manhattan to a chain of boutique hotels along the East Coast, from real estate towers worth hundreds of millions of dollars to an underground network no one dared to mention in public. His penthouse sat atop a tower in Tribeca, looking out over the entire Manhattan skyline, where the city lights at night spilled beneath his feet as if all of New York belonged to him, and in some way, it did. When Dominic Valente walked into a room, every conversation stopped. Not because he was tall, though he stood close to 6 feet, one with broad shoulders and a solid build that looked carved from stone. Not because of the perfectly tailored black suit, or the watch on his wrist worth as much as a whole house. It was because of his eyes. Dark gray eyes, cold as steel, meeting whoever stood before him with a terrifying calm, as if he'd already calculated every move before the other person could even open their mouth. No one dared to hold Dominic Valente's gaze for more than 3 seconds. The ones who tried didn't want to try a second time. He was ruthless with enemies, distant with strangers, and painfully quiet. In the underworld, people called him many names, but the most common was the quiet one, because Dominic never yelled, never threatened, never said things twice. He spoke once, and things happened. But what truly defined Dominic Valente wasn't power, wasn't money, wasn't the fear he planted in other people's hearts. What truly defined him was a 63-year-old woman living in an old house in Brooklyn, his mother, Maggie Valente. She was Dominic's only weakness, and also the one weakness he never tried to hide. Because everything Dominic had today, every dollar, every building, every connection, every breath he still drew, came from that woman. Dominic's story began with blood and fire. His father, Giovanni Valente, had been the previous boss of the family, a man respected, feared, and finally betrayed. Giovanni was assassinated right outside the family's restaurant in Little Italy on a winter night by the very people he'd once trusted. Dominic was only 22 then, still a kid in the eyes of the underworld. No one thought he'd survive, let alone take control. But they were wrong. Dominic didn't run. He stood in his father's blood, looked down, and in those 22-year-old eyes, something died, and something far more frightening woke up. Within 2 years, Dominic rebuilt the entire empire from the ashes, removing each traitor one by one, forging new alliances, expanding territory, and turning the Valente name into something no one on the East Coast dared to challenge. His hands were stained with blood. He knew it. He didn't deny it. But there was one thing blood and violence could never reach: the last soft corner of his heart, the corner reserved for his mother. Every major decision in his life, Dominic asked Maggie's opinion. Not because she understood business or the underworld, but because she understood people. She was the only moral compass Dominic still had, and he knew that if he lost that compass, he'd lose himself right along with it. And this was the man Natasha Kensington had set her sights on. Margaret Valente, or Maggie, the way everyone in the Brooklyn neighborhood called her, was the woman behind everything Dominic had, and yet she never claimed to be anything other than a mother. She was 63, her silver hair twisted into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, her thin hands mapped with calluses from decades of work, and her dark brown eyes carrying a gentle sorrow she never let anyone see unless she believed she was alone. Maggie was born in a small hillside village in Sicily, where summers burned the skin and winters cut straight to the bone. She came to America at 18 with a cloth suitcase and not a single cent in her pocket, carrying nothing but faith in God and hands willing to do whatever work appeared. She met Giovanni Valente in Brooklyn, loved him, married him, and gave him a son. She knew who her husband was, knew what he did, but she never asked, never interfered. She only loved him and raised their child. Then that night came, the night Giovanni never stepped through the door again. She got the call at 2 o'clock in the morning. Tommy's voice was trembling on the other end, and back then Tommy was just a 20-year-old kid running behind Giovanni. Maggie didn't scream, didn't faint, didn't wail. She set the phone down, walked into Dominic's bedroom, looked at her son sleeping, and whispered, "From now on, it's just you and me." Then she locked herself in the bathroom and cried for 3 hours without making a sound, because she didn't want her son to hear. The years after Giovanni's death were hell. The family collapsed. Allies turned their backs. Enemies surged in like vultures catching the scent of a body. And Maggie, an immigrant woman with no degree, no power, no weapon, had to protect her only child alone while wolves circled closer. She worked 3 jobs at once. She washed laundry for families in the neighborhood. She scrubbed dishes in an Italian restaurant in Bensonhurst from 6 in the evening until midnight. And she sewed and mended clothes for neighbors whenever she could. She slept, on average, 4 hours a night. Her hands split open from soap. Her back ached from standing too long. But she never complained, not once. And yet the most brutal thing wasn't poverty. It was the night the Donnellys came. Patrick Donnelly Sr., the father of today's Patrick Donnelly, wanted to swallow the Valente territory whole. He knew Dominic was Giovanni's only son, the seed that could revive the family. He wanted that seed crushed. 3 men came to Maggie's house at midnight. They kicked the door in, dragged her out of bed, punched and kicked her, yanked her hair, and screamed in her face, "Where's the boy? Hand him over." Maggie had already sent Dominic to a friend's house in New Jersey because she could feel danger moving toward them. She lay on the kitchen floor with blood running from a cut on her forehead, her eyes swollen shut, ribs broken, and still, she didn't talk, not a word. They beat her for nearly an hour. In the end, they left, believing she truly didn't know where her son was. The scar on Maggie's forehead from that night never faded. It sat just above her left eyebrow, almost 3 centimeters long, and every time Dominic saw it, his jaw clenched and his eyes went dark. That was why Dominic Valente was ruthless with his enemies, not because he liked violence, but because he remembered the scar above his mother's brow. When Dominic grew up and rebuilt the empire, the first thing he did was renovate the old Brooklyn house for her. He wanted to buy her a mansion on the Upper East Side, wanted to bring her to the Tribeca penthouse, but Maggie refused. She said, "This house is where your father hugged me for the last time before he walked out that door. I'm not going anywhere." And Dominic didn't argue again, so Maggie stayed in Brooklyn, in the old house with a garden of white roses in back that she tended with her own hands each morning, where she went to Catholic Mass every Sunday, where she wore the rosary Giovanni gave her on their wedding day, where she kneaded dough by hand to make fresh pasta every week for Dominic, where she baked the famous tiramisu Dominic had been addicted to since childhood. She wore simple floral blouses, flat shoes, and she never touched the unlimited credit card Dominic kept for her in a drawer. All she needed was her rose garden, her church, her kitchen, and her son coming home for dinner every Sunday. That was enough. And there was one thing Maggie taught Dominic when he was still a skinny boy with bruised knees from fighting in the street, a sentence he carved into his memory deeper than any lesson the underworld ever gave him. "You can be strong against the whole world, but don't ever lose your heart, my son. Because when you lose your heart, you lose everything." And this was the woman Natasha Kensington had decided to destroy. And it was on a September night, at an event Dominic was supposed to attend for exactly 30 minutes and then leave as always, that everything began to shift. The annual charity gala at the Pierre Hotel on 5th Avenue was one of New York's most prestigious nights, where the city's elite gathered beneath crystal chandeliers, sipped champagne, and pretended to care about poor children while, in truth, they came to be seen and to watch everyone else. The Valente family was the main sponsor of the gala, partly for public image, partly because it was the most polite way to turn dirty money into clean money. Dominic walked into the ballroom with Tommy close behind him, 2 more bodyguards waiting outside by the car. He wore a black 3-piece suit, no tie, the top buttons open, looking both elegant and dangerous. As he passed, people nodded, offered stiff smiles, then stepped aside to clear his path. Dominic didn't like events like this. He hated small talk, hated damp handshakes, hated the way people laughed when they were really afraid. He'd planned to leave after 20 minutes, but then he saw her. Natasha Kensington stood alone beside a marble column at the far corner of the room, a glass of red wine in her hand, her eyes fixed forward with a calm Dominic rarely saw in anyone in that room. She wore a long black gown that brushed the floor, simple but cut perfectly, emphasizing her tall, slender figure. Her long dark hair fell loose over her shoulders, her makeup so light it was almost nothing, except for deep red lips that became the only sharp accent. Around her neck was a thin silver chain with a small stone, and on her ears a pair of pearl earrings. She looked elegant, expensive, but not showy. What Dominic didn't know was that the dress had been borrowed from a high-end rental boutique. The necklace was a finely made fake, and the pearl earrings had been left to her by her grandmother. Natasha Kensington, 30 years old, the daughter of Richard Kensington, a real estate businessman who used to have his name on the list of New York's richest men. Used to. Because Richard Kensington had gone bankrupt 2 years earlier, buried under so much debt he'd been forced to sell the last house on the Upper East Side and rent a small apartment in Queens, but he kept that secret the way a man hides a body in a basement, and Richard had been planning for months. He studied every boss, every millionaire, every single billionaire in New York, and in the end he chose Dominic Valente. Not because Dominic was the richest, but because Dominic was the loneliest. A 36-year-old man who'd never had a serious relationship, who lived alone in a penthouse, and whose only weakness was a heart. Richard trained Natasha the way you train an agent: how to speak, how to stand, how to look, how to stay silent at the right moment, how to smile at the right time. He hired a private investigator to follow Dominic for 3 months, learned what wine he liked, what kind of music he hated, what genre of books he read, and most of all, that he despised women who clung to power. So Natasha was taught to appear as the opposite: independent, intelligent, and slightly challenging. That night, when Dominic approached her, Natasha didn't turn her head right away. She let him stand there for 2 seconds, then slowly turned, looked at him with cool blue-gray eyes, and said in a low voice, "Mr. Valente, I thought you'd leave earlier than this." Dominic was slightly startled. She knew his name, knew his habits, and yet her voice didn't tremble. She didn't bow her head, didn't flatter him, didn't act afraid. She met his gaze directly, something almost no one in New York dared to do. And for the first time in a long time, Dominic Valente felt curious. They talked for nearly 2 hours that night. Natasha spoke about Italian Renaissance art, about Tuscan wine, about Art Deco architecture in Manhattan. She was smart, sharp, and had a dry humor Dominic found interesting. She didn't ask him about his work, didn't mention money, didn't seem impressed by anything around them. She made Dominic feel like he was just an ordinary man talking to an attractive woman. He didn't know that everything she said that night had been researched, rehearsed, and performed with perfect precision down to every note. 3 steps behind them, Tommy stood with his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving Natasha for a single second. The instincts of a man who'd spent his whole life in the underworld were screaming that something was wrong. This girl was too perfect, too calm, too timed. But then Tommy looked at Dominic, and he saw something he'd never seen on his boss's face in 14 years. Real interest in a woman. Tommy kept his mouth shut. He wasn't going to ruin this moment. Not yet. And that night, when Dominic sat in the car on the way back to the penthouse, he did something he'd never done after any social event. He smiled. The next 3 weeks passed like a dream Dominic didn't want to wake from. They saw each other almost every day. Dinner at a small, discreet Japanese restaurant in the West Village that Dominic loved, and she ordered the exact steak he preferred without needing to ask. An afternoon walk through Central Park, where she talked about her time studying abroad in Florence and described the late-day light slipping through the dome of the Duomo in a voice so vivid it felt like a spell. Late nights on the Tribeca penthouse balcony, looking down at the city, where she could sit in silence beside him without trying to fill the space with words, and Dominic found that silence strangely comforting. Natasha never asked about his work. Not once. When Dominic's phone rang in the middle of dinner, and he had to step away to take the call, she only smiled, took a sip of wine, and waited. She didn't ask who it was, didn't ask what happened, didn't act curious or irritated. She understood the rules without anyone teaching her, or at least she created the feeling that she did. She made Dominic feel like he wasn't the Valente boss when he was with her. He was just Dominic, a 36-year-old man on dates with a woman who made him want to laugh more than he had in years. But every night, after Dominic drove her home or after she left the penthouse, Natasha slid into the back seat of a taxi, pulled out her phone, and called her father. Her voice was completely different then, cold, precise, without a hint of emotion. This week was good. He's starting to trust. He talked about his childhood, about his mother, about his father. He's opening the door. On the other end, Richard Kensington drew on a cigarette, his voice rough with smoke. Good. Don't rush. Don't push. Let him come to you. When you become his wife, everything for our family comes back. Natasha ended the call and stared out through the taxi window. Manhattan streets ran backward through the dark. She felt nothing. No guilt, no hesitation, not even the smallest tremor from those evenings beside Dominic. To her, it was all work, a long-term investment whose dividend would be hundreds of millions of dollars. But Richard Kensington, no matter how cunning he was, didn't know his daughter was playing a game far bigger than he imagined, because Natasha Kensington didn't have just one boss. She had two. On nights when she didn't see Dominic and didn't call her father, Natasha used a second phone, a prepaid handset bought with cash at a grocery store in Queens. Unregistered, untraceable, she texted only one number. Patrick Donnelly's. Patrick Donnelly, 45, an Irish Mafia boss who controlled most of the routes in northern Manhattan and part of the Bronx, the man whose father had once ordered Maggie beaten until her ribs cracked in that Brooklyn house years ago, the sworn enemy of the Valente family. Natasha met Donnelly for the first time in a private bar in Hell's Kitchen, 3 months before she appeared at the gala at the Pierre. No one knew about that meeting. Not Richard. Not Tommy. Not Dominic. Donnelly wanted internal information on the Valente family. Schedules, weak points, shipping routes, lists of allies. Natasha wanted insurance. She was smart enough to know that if she only relied on Dominic's money, she'd always be dependent on a man, and she hated dependence. Donnelly paid her in cash for every small piece of information, and promised that after the marriage was complete, and she had access to Dominic's inner circle, the money would increase tenfold. Natasha agreed. She wasn't loyal to anyone, not to her father, not to Dominic, not to Donnelly. She was loyal only to herself, and in those 3 sweet weeks of dating, while Dominic slowly opened his heart for the first time in 36 years, Natasha Kensington was busy selling each small piece of news about him to the deadliest enemy his family had. She was a snake coiled in the lion's chest, and the lion was sleeping deep. After 3 weeks of dating, Dominic did something he'd never done with any woman before. He took Natasha to his mother's house. It was Sunday afternoon, the most sacred day of the week for the Valente family, the day when, storm or gang war, Dominic always showed up at the Brooklyn house to eat with his mother. When the black Bentley pulled up in front, Natasha looked through the window and had to swallow an instinctive frown. The house was an old 2-story place, with faded red brick, slightly cracked concrete steps, a porch wrapped in green vines, and a small front garden of white roses that Maggie tended every morning. To Dominic, it was the most sacred place on earth. To Natasha, it was proof that her future mother-in-law was an immigrant old woman who didn't know how to enjoy anything, living in a dump while her son had hundreds of millions of dollars in his account. She stepped out, looped her arm through Dominic's, and put on the most perfect smile she owned. Maggie had been preparing since early morning. She'd gotten up at 5 o'clock to go to Mass, then came home and started cooking. The tomato sauce she made by hand from her mother's Sicilian recipe had been bubbling on the stove since 9 in the morning, filling the whole house with a sweet, familiar warmth. The fresh pasta was kneaded by hand, rolled thin, cut into ribbons, and draped over a wooden rack in the kitchen. Italian roast chicken with rosemary and lemon, a salad dressed with olive oil, crisp baked ciabatta, and in the center of the table, a 3-layer tiramisu Dominic had been addicted to since he was a little boy, the white lace tablecloth Maggie had crocheted over months, a vase of white roses from the back garden, simple white plates she'd been using for more than 20 years. Everything was modest, but every detail carried a mother's love for her son. Maggie greeted them at the door, wiping her hands quickly on her floral apron. She hugged Natasha tightly, warmly, sincerely. "Welcome to my home, my daughter. Dominic's been talking about you so much. I'm so happy." Natasha returned the hug, but her body was stiff as iron. She patted Maggie's back twice and pulled away, wearing a smile anyone would mistake for genuine, except that it never reached her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Valente. Your home is so cozy." The word cozy left Natasha's mouth with a tone only another woman would recognize. It wasn't praise. It was a code for small, old, and not worthy. Dominic didn't hear it. He was too busy hugging his mother and breathing in the familiar scent of tomato sauce with the smile of a 10-year-old boy. But Maggie heard it. Her ears had heard enough voices in 63 years to know when a word carried a meaning different from its surface. They sat at the table. Dominic ate like a man who hadn't eaten all week, piling his plate, praising his mother, telling jokes, trying to make the two most important women in his life feel comfortable together. Natasha sat across from Maggie and ate very little. She used her fork to lift a single strand of pasta, brought it to her mouth, chewed slowly with the expression of someone trying hard to be polite. When Maggie offered her more, Natasha shook her head gently. "No, thank you. I'm watching my diet." Dominic laughed. "Baby, you don't need to diet. Have more. My mom's pasta is the best in the world." Natasha gave a tight little smile. "I'm sure it is, babe." Then it happened. Dominic's phone vibrated. Tommy. Something urgent had come up. A shipment issue at the Newark port. Dominic apologized, pushed back his chair, and stepped out to the back porch to take the call. 2 bodyguards stayed outside the gate, far enough that they couldn't hear anything inside. Maggie was at the sink washing dishes with her back turned, and right then, the mask fell. Exactly 15 seconds. Natasha rose from the table, walked up behind Maggie with steps as quiet as a cat. She stopped close beside her, tilted her head, and spoke in a low, cold voice without a trace of emotion. "He deserves better than this dump, don't you think?" Maggie stopped washing. Her hand still held a wet plate, but her whole body went rigid. She turned her head slowly and looked at Natasha. "What did you just say?" Natasha was already wearing her sweet smile again, her voice clear as a bell. "I said the food was absolutely delicious, Mrs. Valente. Thank you so much for lunch." At that exact moment, Dominic walked back in. "Everything okay?" Natasha turned, placed a hand on Dominic's arm, leaned her head against his shoulder. "Everything's perfect, babe. Your mom is such a sweetheart." Maggie stood there holding the wet plate with a grip so tight her knuckles ached, feeling a cold line crawl up her spine. She'd just seen something in Natasha's eyes. Something dark, calculating, dangerous. But when she looked at her son, Dominic was looking at Natasha with an expression Maggie had never seen on his face before. The look of a man in love, and Maggie's heart tore itself in two. Had she misheard? Was she jealous because, for the first time, another woman had taken her son's heart? Was she becoming the kind of selfish mother-in-law people whispered about? The kind who couldn't accept that her son had grown up and loved someone else? She decided not to say anything. Not yet, but that night, after Dominic and Natasha had left, Maggie sat alone in the kitchen where the air still carried the faint scent of tomato sauce, her fingers wrapped tight around her rosary, and deep down, she knew she hadn't misheard. Natasha Kensington had begun her game, and the rules were simple. Destroy Maggie little by little, leave no trace, until she was nothing but a fading shadow in Dominic's life. And when the wedding was certain, when the money was within reach, Natasha would finish the rest. In the months that followed, Natasha Kensington carried out her campaign with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't need a scalpel. She only needed words, and every word was calculated to sever an invisible thread connecting Dominic to his mother. Gentle enough that he didn't feel pain, gentle enough that he didn't realize he was losing the most precious thing he had. It began with small sentences that sounded harmless. "Honey, tonight we've been invited to dinner at Le Bernardin. I don't think your mom would like that kind of high-end French place. It's too fussy for her. Let's just go, the two of us, and we'll visit her next weekend." Dominic nodded. It made sense. His mother really didn't like restaurants like that. "The next week, babe, tonight's gala is black tie. It's all Manhattan high society. I'm afraid your mom would feel out of place around those people. She wouldn't be comfortable. If you love her, don't force her to go." Dominic nodded again. He thought Natasha was being considerate. He thought she was protecting Maggie from situations that would embarrass her. He didn't see the thread being cut. Then the weekend came. "Honey, let's go to the Hamptons this weekend. I'm exhausted. I need to rest. We can call your mom next week." And that Sunday, for the first time in years, Dominic's chair at Maggie's table sat empty. Maggie sat alone at the table she'd set for two. Fresh pasta she'd needed since morning, tomato sauce that had been simmering since 9 o'clock, a 3-layer tiramisu in the center. Everything was ready, except her son. She stared at the empty chair, watched the pasta cool, then reached for her phone and called. No answer. An hour later, Dominic texted, "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm busy this weekend. I'll come next week." Next week didn't happen either. And the week after that. There was always a reason. A work trip. An important dinner with a partner. A weekend getaway Natasha had already booked. Every reason sounded reasonable. Every cancellation came with a sweet apology. But when you put them together, they became a wall rising higher and higher between Dominic and Maggie. The Sunday calls, once more sacred than $1 million business meeting, became 3 rushed minutes. "Mom, I'm good. I'm busy. I'll call you later." Then he didn't call. The Sunday dinners, the thing Dominic never missed, even if the world was falling apart, were canceled so often that Maggie began to fear cooking at all, because she couldn't bear to look at cold food sitting untouched on the table. But she still cooked. Every Sunday. Because hope is stubborn. Because maybe this week he'd come. Natasha was even more subtle than that. She started posting photos of the two of them online. Dominic and Natasha in the Hamptons. Dominic and Natasha at Michelin star restaurants. Dominic and Natasha at a yacht party. She didn't send the pictures to Maggie, but she knew Maggie would see them. And Maggie did. Rosa, the family's loyal housekeeper, visited Maggie every week. And Maggie and Rosa looked at the photos on a phone screen. Maggie didn't speak, but Rosa saw her hands tremble as she scrolled past each image. Her son was smiling in those pictures, smiling brightly beside Natasha, in a world Maggie didn't belong to. And the most painful part wasn't that Maggie was losing her son. The most painful part was that she understood. She understood Dominic wasn't trying to abandon her. He was in love. And when a man is in love, he can go blind. Natasha didn't need to insult Maggie in front of Dominic. She only had to fill Dominic's time until there was no space left for his mother at all. And that tactic worked better than any bullet. Because Maggie had survived bullets. She'd survived enemy fists. She'd survived everything the underworld had thrown at her. But she didn't know how to survive her son, slowly disappearing from her life, not through violence, but through the smile of another woman. Then the night Maggie feared most finally came. Nearly 5 months after that first meal in Brooklyn, her phone rang at 9 o'clock at night. Dominic's name lit up the screen, and Maggie's heart jumped into a faster rhythm, because lately her son rarely called, and every time that number appeared, she felt both joy and dread at once. She answered. Dominic's voice on the other end was nothing like his usual self, not the low, cold voice of the Valente boss, but the voice of a child bursting to show his mother a triumph, breathless, overflowing with happiness. "Mom?" I proposed to Natasha. She said yes. "We're getting married, Mom." Maggie gripped the phone so hard her knuckles went white. Her heart didn't race anymore. It felt as if an invisible hand had closed around it and squeezed. She wanted to scream, "No, my son, you don't know who she is. You didn't hear what I heard." But then there was his voice. That voice. That pure happiness she hadn't heard from Dominic since Giovanni was alive. The voice of a boy who still believed the world could be good, that love was real, that he'd finally found someone to walk through life with. And Maggie couldn't break that. She had no proof. She only had 15 seconds of a sentence Natasha had denied, and the instinct of a mother that anyone could dismiss as jealousy. She swallowed her tears, forced her voice into calm, and said, "Congratulations, my son. May God bless you both." Dominic laughed on the other end, loud and bright. "I love you, Mom. I'll bring Natasha over this Sunday so we can celebrate together." "Yes, my son. I'll make tiramisu." She ended the call. The house was so quiet she could hear the wall clock ticking in the kitchen. She walked slowly to the sofa in the living room, sat down, and looked toward the mantel. Giovanni's photo sat there in an old wooden frame, taken on their wedding day more than 40 years ago. Giovanni was smiling, one arm around Maggie's waist, his hair glossy black, his eyes bright, as if the whole world belonged to him. Maggie whispered to the picture, her voice trembling, so small it felt like only she and he could hear it. "Do you see? Our son is walking into a trap he doesn't even know is there, and his mother is standing here watching, unable to do anything." Her hand reached to her throat and closed around the rosary Giovanni had given her on their wedding day, the wooden beads worn smooth from decades of being held every night. And for the first time since the night Giovanni never came home, for the first time since the night she lay on the kitchen floor with broken ribs and blood on her forehead and didn't make a sound, for the first time in so many years, Margaret Valente cried. She cried without a sound, just like that night in the bathroom when she locked the door so her son wouldn't hear. Tears ran down her wrinkled cheeks, fell onto the rosary, fell onto her simple floral dress, fell onto the calloused hands that had endured too much in one lifetime. She cried because she knew. She knew in her bones that Natasha Kensington would destroy her son, but she had no way to prove it. The wedding preparations began immediately, and Natasha wanted everything to be perfect. Or more precisely, she wanted everything to be so expensive it felt suffocating. Dominic never cared about money when it came to the woman he loved, and Natasha knew that well. The wedding was booked at the Plaza Hotel, the Grand Ballroom, where the venue fee alone swallowed a number most Americans would spend a lifetime trying to earn. 400 guests, including allied families, politicians, business people, and the most powerful faces on the East Coast. Flowers were imported from the Netherlands, thousands of white and pale pink peonies flown in on a private jet. The wedding dress was custom-made by a top designer on Madison Avenue, priced at $50,000, trimmed with French lace and freshwater pearls. A 6-carat diamond engagement ring set in platinum sat on Natasha's finger in a black velvet box like a declaration to the world that she had won. And it was during these preparations, with Dominic buried in business and leaving Natasha in full control of every detail, that her true face began to show more and more often. But always when Dominic wasn't there. The first incident happened at a bridal boutique on Madison Avenue, where Natasha brought her upper-class friends to try on bridesmaid dresses. Natasha invited Maggie to come, not because she wanted her involved, but because she needed an audience for her performance. Maggie arrived in the simplest floral dress she owned, hair neatly pinned up, rosary around her neck, an old cloth bag in her hand. She stepped into the shop and immediately felt out of place among the shining mirrors, the racks of glittering evening gowns, and 4 perfectly made-up women sipping champagne on a velvet sofa. They were Natasha's friends, or at least the kind of friends you have when you live inside New York's upper world, the kind who exist only when you have money and vanish the moment you don't. Natasha was standing in front of a mirror, fitting a pale blue bridesmaid dress on one of them, when Maggie walked in. Natasha turned, looked Maggie up and down, then glanced at her friends with a smile only cruel women wear. "Ladies, this is my mother-in-law, Maggie. She's traditional." A little giggle. Then Natasha tilted her head and lowered her voice just enough for Maggie to hear, but low enough to deny later. "My mother-in-law still dresses like she just got off the boat from Sicily." Laughter rose again, louder this time, unhidden. The 4 women laughed and looked at Maggie with pity mixed with contempt. Maggie stood in the doorway, both hands gripping the strap of her cloth bag. She heard every word clearly. She understood every word. Heat rushed to her face, her eyes burned, but she didn't cry, not in front of them. She quietly turned, stepped into an empty fitting room beside her, closed the door, sat on the small chair, wrapped her fingers around her rosary, and bit down on her lip until she tasted blood, just to keep herself from making a sound. Outside, the laughter still leaked through the thin wall. The second incident happened 2 weeks later, at the rehearsal dinner in an upscale Italian restaurant on the Upper East Side. Maggie had prepared carefully for that night. She knew she would meet Dominic's friends and partners, important people, wealthy people. She didn't want her son to feel ashamed of his mother, so she saved for months, money she'd kept aside from before Dominic ever became rich, money she refused to take from him out of pride, and she bought a new dress. The nicest dress Maggie had ever owned, deep blue, silk, simple but elegant. She stood in front of her mirror at home for almost an hour, asking herself if she looked worthy, then took a deep breath and walked out the door. At the restaurant, Maggie sat beside Rosa, who had been invited to keep her company. Dominic sat at the head of the long table, Natasha beside him, her hand resting on his, laughing bright and effortless. The dinner was going smoothly until Natasha stood up, lifted a glass of red wine, and said she wanted to come greet her mother-in-law. She walked toward Maggie with a sweet smile, leaned down as if to hug her, and then her hand tilted, just slightly. The red wine poured straight onto Maggie's chest. Dark wine spread across the deep blue silk like blood, soaking fast, widening, destroying the dress Maggie had bought with every saved dollar. Natasha lifted a hand to her mouth, eyes wide in a perfectly performed shock. "Oh my God, I'm so clumsy. Mrs. Valente, I'm so sorry." Her voice was full of remorse, but her eyes held Maggie's, and in those blue-gray eyes there wasn't a single drop of regret, only cold pleasure. Maggie looked down at her dress. She didn't look at the stain. She looked at months of saving, hours standing in front of her mirror wondering if she was pretty enough, a whole lifetime of humility being crushed by a slight turn of someone's wrist. Rosa stood immediately, grabbed napkins, helped Maggie rise. Dominic at the far end of the table only saw the incident from a distance, hurried over. "Mom, are you okay?" Natasha moved faster. "Babe, it was totally my fault. I'm so sorry. I'll buy her a new dress tomorrow, I promise." Maggie looked at her son, saw the worry in his eyes, and she said what she always said. "It's okay, my son. It's just a dress." But it wasn't just a dress, and Maggie knew it, and Natasha knew it too. After the dress incident at the rehearsal dinner, Maggie decided she couldn't stay silent anymore. She had to talk to Dominic. She had to tell her son what was happening, even without clear proof, even knowing Dominic might think she was just a jealous mother-in-law. But she was his mother, and a mother's instinct doesn't lie. She called Dominic and said she needed to see him alone, just the two of them, without Natasha. "My son, I need to talk to you. It's important. This Sunday, can you come to my house by yourself?" Dominic agreed. But that night, when he lay in bed and told Natasha, the way he always told her everything, Natasha understood at once. The old woman was about to speak, and if she spoke, even if Dominic didn't believe her right away, a seed of doubt would be planted. Natasha couldn't allow that. Not when she'd come this far. That night, after Dominic fell into a deep sleep, Natasha took the prepaid phone from the hidden pocket inside her purse, stepped onto the penthouse balcony, and texted Patrick Donnelly. The message was short. "The old woman is about to talk. I need her quiet. No injuries. Just make her afraid." 2 days later, when Maggie opened her front door early in the morning to go out and water her roses like she did every day, she saw it on the step. A black envelope, no sender, no stamp, no address. Someone had placed it there in the night, right at her door, right under the nose of the security Dominic had assigned to protect her. Maggie picked up the envelope with trembling hands and opened it. Inside were 5 black and white photos. A photo of her going to church on Sunday morning, taken from across the street. A photo of her shopping in Little Italy, taken from behind. A photo of her watering the flowers in her back garden, taken from an angle she never believed anyone could see. A photo of her sitting by her bedroom window reading, shot through the curtains. And a photo of her kneeling in prayer before the fireplace, where Giovanni's picture sat. Every photo showed that someone had been watching her for weeks, knew her schedule, knew her habits, and could reach her any time they wanted. Lying among the photos was a white lily, its petals slightly wilted. In Italian culture, the white lily is a funeral flower, the kind you place on a coffin. Maggie understood immediately. She'd lived long enough in this world to recognize the Mafia's wordless language, and at the bottom of the envelope was a strip of white paper with letters cut from newspapers, each character taken from a different headline so no handwriting could be traced. "Keep your mouth shut, old woman." Maggie collapsed onto the step. Her legs wouldn't hold her. She wasn't afraid for herself. She'd been beaten until her ribs broke and didn't cry. She wasn't afraid of death. What frightened her was what she realized right after. Someone outside the Valente family was involved in this. These photos weren't taken by a 30-year-old girl. This was professional work, underworld work, someone who knew how to stalk without being seen. And if she told Dominic, he wouldn't just cancel the wedding. He'd hunt down whoever was behind it. He'd start a war. Blood would spill. It could be Dominic's blood. It could be Tommy's. It could be her own. Maggie stared at the wilted white lily in her hand, stared down at the photos of her ordinary life laid bare like a warning that she wasn't safe anywhere. And she made the most painful decision of her life. She stuffed the envelope into a locked drawer in her bedroom, beside a spare rosary and an old Bible. She called Dominic back, her voice so calm, she surprised even herself with it. "My son, I've thought about it again. It's nothing important. I just wanted to ask you about the wedding menu. You don't need to come alone. If you're busy, We can talk on the phone." She ended the call, sat on her bed, and gripped her rosary until the wooden beads pressed hard into her palm. Maggie chose silence, not because she was weak, but because she loved her son more than she loved herself. 2 weeks before the wedding, Maggie received a text from Natasha, inviting her to the wedding planner's office in Midtown to go over the final details together. Maggie was surprised. It was the first time Natasha had ever taken the initiative to include her in any part of the planning. She wondered if she'd been wrong about her, if Natasha was trying to change, trying to open her heart. A small part of Maggie, the part that always wanted to believe there was good in people, lit up with a fragile thread of hope. She put on her cleanest white blouse, a simple black skirt, fastened her rosary around her neck, and asked Rosa to take her there. The wedding planner's office was on the 12th floor of a glass building in Midtown, so luxurious that Maggie felt her old flat shoes didn't deserve to touch the polished marble floor. Natasha was already there with 2 event staff members, spreading the seating chart across a large table. She looked up when Maggie entered and gave the smile Maggie had grown used to in a way that hurt, a smile that never reached her eyes. "Oh, Mrs. Valente, glad you could make it. Come, take a look." Maggie stepped to the table and studied the chart, the flower lists, the table designs. Everything was grand, lavish, perfect by Natasha's standards. Then Maggie saw the floral list: white peonies, pale pink peonies, and lilies, no roses. She hesitated, then spoke softly, her voice careful and gentle, as if she were asking permission, rather than offering a suggestion. "My dear, I have a small idea. Could we add a few white roses on the tables? Giovanni, Dominic's father, used to grow white roses for me in the back garden. It would be a way for him to be there on his son's wedding day." When Maggie finished, her eyes brightened with a tender hope. She thought it was a small request, a meaningful detail anyone would agree to. She was wrong. Natasha lifted her head. The smile disappeared. Her blue-gray eyes turned cold in an instant, as if someone had flipped a switch behind her irises. "Excuse me." Maggie repeated herself, even softer. "Just a few white roses, my dear, to remember Giovanni." "I heard you." Natasha cut in, her voice suddenly sharp. She straightened, both hands pressing on the table, staring Maggie down with a contempt she didn't even bother to hide anymore. "You know what? I've had enough. I've been patient. I've been polite. But let me make something very clear to you." She walked around the table and stopped in front of Maggie, close enough that Maggie could smell the expensive perfume on her throat. "You're nothing. You're nothing but a dishwasher who got lucky her son made money. You spent your whole life scrubbing other people's floors and sewing other people's clothes. You don't know anything about this world. You don't belong at my wedding, let alone telling me what flowers to put on my tables." Each word fell like a knife. Rosa stood in the corner with her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with horror. The 2 event staff members froze, too afraid to move. Maggie stood there looking at Natasha, and in that moment she didn't see a 30-year-old woman. She saw something older, darker. Something she'd seen in the eyes of the men who broke her ribs on the Brooklyn kitchen floor years ago. Pure cruelty. And then Natasha slapped her. Natasha's right hand swung up and cracked across Maggie's left cheek with full force. The sound filled the silent room like a gunshot. Maggie's head snapped to the side. Her body stumbled, nearly falling. Her cheek burned, and tears rose not from pain but from shock, from the realization that the woman about to marry her son had just struck her in front of other people, without a second of hesitation. But Maggie didn't fall. She steadied herself, straightened, and slowly lifted a hand to touch the heat blooming across her cheek. She looked at Natasha. She didn't say a word. She didn't scream, didn't curse, didn't plead. She only looked, with dark brown eyes that had watched her husband get murdered, that had once stared up from a blood-soaked kitchen floor without giving away where her son was hiding. She held Natasha with that gaze, then turned and walked out of the room with a dignity no hand, no slap, could ever take from her. Rosa ran after her into the hallway, sobbing, grabbing Maggie's hand. "Mrs. Maggie, you have to tell Mr. Dominic. You have to. She can't treat you like this." Maggie stopped and looked at Rosa. Her eyes were red but dry, her voice low and slow. "If I tell Dominic, do you know what he'll do? He'll kill her. You know who he is. You know he won't be able to control it. And then I'll lose my son to prison. I'd rather take 100 slaps than lose him." Rosa couldn't speak. She only cried. That night, in the quiet Brooklyn house, Maggie knelt on the wooden floor of her bedroom, in front of the fireplace where Giovanni's photo looked down at her. The small candle she'd lit flickered, its light trembling across the old frame. The scar on her forehead throbbed, as if reminding her she'd endured worse than this, and still lived. Her left cheek was still marked red. She gripped her rosary, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Giovanni, give me strength. I don't know what to do anymore. I'm afraid of losing our boy. Not to bullets, not to war, but to the blind love in his heart. Please, God, show me the way." Maggie knelt before the fireplace for nearly 2 hours that night, and when she finally stood, her knees aching, her back stiff, something inside her had shifted. It wasn't that the pain disappeared. The pain was still there, her cheek still throbbing, her heart still heavy. But beside that pain, something else had woken up, something she'd thought had been asleep for a long time. The steel of the woman who once lay on a kitchen floor with broken ribs and never opened her mouth to give up a single word. Maggie looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, looked at the redness on her left cheek, looked at the old scar on her forehead, and she remembered who she was. She wasn't a weak old woman meant to be pushed around. She was Margaret Valente. She was the woman who stared straight into the eyes of 3 Donnelly men while they kicked and punched her and didn't blink. She was the woman who raised her son alone among wolves and never let the boy take a single scratch. That 30-year-old girl thought Maggie was easy prey. She was wrong. The next morning, Maggie called Rosa. Her voice was calm, clear, no longer trembling the way it had before. "Rosa, come to the house. We need to talk." Rosa arrived within an hour. The 2 women sat in the kitchen with the door closed, curtains drawn, speaking in voices low enough to keep the walls from listening. Maggie said, "I'm not telling Dominic. You know why. You know my son. If he learns she slapped me, he won't ask. He won't listen. He won't wait. He'll react in the only way he knows. And then either she dies, or someone dies, or my son goes to prison. I won't accept any of those outcomes." Rosa nodded, her tears not yet dry. "So what are you going to do?" Maggie looked at Rosa, and in those dark brown eyes there was a light Rosa had never seen before. Not anger, but absolute resolve. "I want Dominic to see it with his own eyes. Hear it with his own ears. Not from my mouth, because he'll think I'm jealous. From her own mouth. I want the truth exposed in a way no one can deny, no one can explain away, and without a single drop of blood being spilled." Rosa stared at Maggie, and in that moment she understood why this woman had survived everything. Not because of luck, but because she was sharper than people assumed. That afternoon, Maggie did something she hadn't done in all these years. She took her old phone and searched for a contact Dominic had saved for her long ago in case of emergency. Franklin Gould, the Valente family attorney, a 55-year-old man Dominic trusted completely with every legal and secret matter. Maggie dialed. Franklin answered on the second ring, his voice surprised because she'd never called him directly. "Mrs. Valente, is something wrong?" Maggie spoke slowly. "Franklin, I need you to investigate someone. Natasha Kensington, her family, her finances, every relationship she has, and especially any connection to Patrick Donnelly." Silence on the other end. Then Franklin's voice dropped. "Donnelly, are you sure?" "I'm sure. Does Mr. Dominic know about this?" "No. And you won't tell him?" "Not yet." Franklin was quiet for a few more seconds. He knew Maggie wasn't the type to speak casually. If she called, she had a reason. "I understand. Give me 1 week." The plan began the very next day. Rosa had a nephew named Marco, 28 years old, a security system technician for a private company in Queens. The young man had nothing to do with the underworld, but he loved Rosa like his own mother, and when she called asking for help without explaining too much, he didn't ask questions. He only said, "Tell me what you need, and I'll do it." Marco came to Maggie's house with a small bag holding 3 pinhole cameras, each one no bigger than the tip of a pen, with batteries that could run continuously for 2 weeks, capturing high-quality video and audio, and transmitting the data to an old laptop Marco had already set up and hidden in the bedroom closet. Rosa was the one who placed the cameras. She knew exactly where Natasha tended to act when Dominic wasn't around, because Rosa was always there, always witnessing, always the shadow Natasha never bothered to notice, because to her a housekeeper was as invisible as furniture. The first camera was hidden inside a framed holy image hanging on the kitchen wall, right above the sink. the same spot where Natasha had twice moved in to humiliate Maggie when Dominic stepped outside. The second camera was tucked into a small porcelain statue of the Virgin Mary on the living room shelf, aimed straight toward the dining table and the front door. The third was a button camera that Rosa wore on her coat whenever she accompanied Maggie to the wedding planner's office or anywhere Natasha might be. Then they waited. 2 weeks, 14 days of continuous recording. Natasha didn't suspect a thing. She kept behaving as if Maggie had been fully broken after that slap. She came to Maggie's house on Sundays with Dominic, put on her fake smile, called Maggie Mom in front of him. Then the moment Dominic stepped away to take a call, she turned to Maggie with those cold eyes and said things like, "You've learned to behave. Keep it up and everything will be fine." The camera in the holy frame captured all of it. But the biggest discovery didn't come from the cameras in Maggie's house. It came from the button camera on Rosa's coat. 1 week before the wedding, Rosa went with Maggie to the plaza to check the flowers and tables one last time. Natasha was there, on the phone in the bridal prep room. She thought she was alone because she didn't notice Rosa standing in the hallway just outside a half-open door. Rosa held still, the button camera on her chest pointed straight through the crack, and Natasha's voice carried out, clear as day. "Pat, everything's on track. After the wedding, I'll have access to his schedule, his security detail, his accounts, everything you need. Just give me 2 months after the ceremony and I'll deliver." There was silence on the other end. Then Natasha continued. "No, he doesn't suspect a thing. He's in love. Blind, stupid love. And the old woman. She's taken care of. She won't say a word after our little reminder." Rosa stood outside that door, gripping her coat, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid Natasha would hear it. Natasha was talking to Donnelly. She wasn't just hunting money. She was a traitor. She was selling Dominic to his family's deadliest enemy. Rosa turned and walked with the lightest steps of her life, out of the hallway, out of the hotel, into the car, and called Maggie with a voice so shaky she had to repeat herself 3 times before Maggie understood. At the same time, Franklin Gould called. He'd finished the investigation, and his voice was low and grave. "Mrs. Valente, I have the results. Richard Kensington is completely bankrupt, $12 million in debt, sued by at least 4 creditors. He's living on high-interest loans. And Natasha, according to my sources, has met Patrick Donnelly at least 7 times in the past 6 months. Meeting locations include a bar in Hell's Kitchen, twice at a small hotel in Hoboken, and 4 times at a rental apartment in Jersey City that Donnelly uses for private dealings." When Maggie heard that, she set the phone down on the kitchen table and closed her eyes. Now she had everything. Video of humiliation and threats, audio of Natasha's call with Donnelly, financial records on the Kensington collapse, proof of 7 meetings between Natasha and the Valente enemy. Maggie opened the kitchen drawer and took out a blank USB drive. Rosa and Marco helped her compile every clip, every recording, every file onto that tiny device. It all fit in her palm. The last step was Rosa reaching out to Eddie, an old friend of Marco's who worked as an audio and video technician for events at the plaza. Rosa told Eddie the family wanted to prepare a surprise video for the groom at the wedding reception, a touching gift from his mother. Eddie agreed without asking more. He would plug the USB into the grand ballroom system and play it on the big screen when Rosa gave the signal. Maggie held the USB in her hand, small and weightless, yet carrying enough force to shatter Natasha Kensington's mask in front of 400 people. She looked at Giovanni's photo on the mantel and whispered, "It's almost time, my love." The wedding day arrived. A Saturday in mid-March. New York was cold, but the sunlight was clean and sharp, as if the sky itself wanted to shine a spotlight on the biggest play Manhattan was about to witness. The Plaza Hotel was dressed like a royal palace. Thousands of white and pale pink peonies imported from the Netherlands covered the entrance to the grand ballroom. White ribbons poured from the high ceiling down toward enormous crystal chandeliers. White candles glowed on every table, and at the far end of the hall, a 2-tier wedding cake stood on a crystal pedestal, coated in pure white frosting with delicate sugar flowers. 400 guests began to arrive from early morning. This wasn't an ordinary wedding. It was an East Coast underworld gathering disguised in high society silk. Allied family bosses flew in from Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, each man arriving with his own entourage. City and state politicians showed up, the kind whose careers had been built in part on Valente donations. Businessmen, lawyers, entertainment stars, all under one roof, sipping Dom Perignon and pretending they didn't know the man they'd come to congratulate could end anyone in that room with a single phone call. Security was tightened until it felt hard to breathe. Tommy coordinated everything. Guards at every entrance and exit, metal detectors at the main gate, 2 armored vehicles parked out front, and a 4-man team in black suits spaced throughout the ballroom, earpieces in, eyes sweeping nonstop. In the groom's preparation room upstairs, Dominic stood before the mirror, adjusting a black tie on a perfectly tailored black suit. Tommy stood behind him, arms crossed, silent for a long moment before he spoke. "Boss, I'm saying this one last time. I've got a bad feeling about her. I don't have proof. I've only got instinct, but my instinct's never been wrong." Dominic met Tommy's eyes through the mirror, jaw clenched. "Tommy, today's my wedding day. You say it again, you're out of this room." Tommy looked at him, let out a breath, and nodded. "I understand." He turned to leave. But before he shut the door, he added, so quietly it felt like only he could hear it, "I hope I'm wrong." 3 blocks away, in the Brooklyn house, Maggie stood in front of her bedroom mirror. She wore a new dress Rosa had helped her choose, a soft silver gray, elegant, right for her neatly pinned silver hair. She studied herself, then looked at the scar on her forehead and lifted a hand to touch it lightly. That scar had lived there for more than 30 years, reminding her every day that she'd endured worse than this and still stood. She reached for the small handbag on the bed, opened it, checked the inside. The USB drive sat in the locked inner pocket, small, safe. She closed the bag, drew a deep breath, and said to Giovanni's photo on the mantel, "Today, my love." When Maggie arrived at the plaza, she headed straight toward the preparation area to see Dominic before the ceremony. In her hand, she carried a white rose, cut from her backyard that morning. The most beautiful bloom from the rose bush Giovanni had planted more than 40 years earlier. In the Valente family tradition, the groom's mother pinned a flower to her son's lapel before the wedding, a silent blessing. But before she could reach Dominic's room, Natasha stepped out of the bridal suite, radiant in a $50,000 gown, hair swept up, a small crystal tiara catching the light. Her eyes landed on the white rose in Maggie's hand, and her expression shifted instantly. She strode over, snatched the rose from Maggie with one sharp motion. Petals scattered across the marble floor. Natasha threw the rose down, placed the heel of her 12-inch stilettos on it, and crushed it. "I don't want your backyard weeds on my husband's suit. This is my wedding, not a Sicilian flea market." Maggie looked at the rose ground beneath Natasha's shoe, Giovanni's rose. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. This time, she smiled. A small, calm smile, almost gentle. And that smile, for the first time, made Natasha hesitate. Something was wrong. This old woman was supposed to be afraid, supposed to bow her head, supposed to step back. But she was smiling. Natasha shoved that discomfort aside and turned back toward the bridal suite. She didn't know it was the smile of someone holding every card and waiting for the exact second to turn them over. The reception began. 400 guests settled into their seats. Champagne flowed. Soft jazz drifted from the live band at the corner of the stage. Maggie entered the ballroom and searched for her table. She passed table 1, table 2, table 3, walking and walking past dozens of round tables covered in white cloth, until she reached the last one, pressed against the door that led into the kitchen, where the clatter of pots and pans leaked through. The table for the groom's mother. The last table in the room. Rosa sat beside her, gripping Maggie's hand beneath the table. Maggie patted Rosa's hand lightly. "It's all right. It's close now." The reception went smoothly for the first few hours. Dominic and Natasha sat at the head table, smiling, accepting congratulations, looking like the most perfect couple in the world. Then it was time to cut the cake. Natasha stood, pulled Dominic toward the 2-tier cake on its crystal pedestal. Cameras flashed, guests clapped, but instead of cutting it, Natasha suddenly turned, her eyes sweeping the room, searching for Maggie. She spotted her at the last table. She smiled, and then, in front of 400 pairs of eyes, Natasha Kensington lifted the 2-tier cake with both hands, carried it, and walked straight toward Maggie. Dominic stood behind her, confused. "Natasha, what are you doing?" She didn't answer. The unsettling calm in Maggie's eyes from earlier had been gnawing at Natasha's nerves, finally shattering her cold professional mask. She marched to the last table, stopped in front of Maggie, and threw the wedding cake straight into her face. White frosting, crumbs, sugar flowers exploded outward. Cake covered Maggie's face, slid into her hair, down her new silver-gray dress, down the rosary at her throat. The entire ballroom froze. 400 people stopped breathing. Natasha stood over Maggie, panting, eyes blazing with wild pleasure, and screamed so her voice filled the grand ballroom. "You want a taste? Here. This is where you belong, under my feet." Absolute silence. Not a single sound. Only the soft drip of frosting falling from Maggie's face onto the marble floor. And Maggie, her face covered in cake, rose from her chair, slowly, shaking but steady, and looked straight at Rosa beside her. She nodded once. Just one small nod. Rosa understood. She pulled out her phone and sent a single word to Eddie in the technical booth. Now, the giant screen behind the stage flickered to life. No one turned it on. No one from the event team gave an order. 400 pairs of eyes, still frozen from the sight of a wedding cake being thrown into Maggie's face, were dragged toward the cold blue-white glow of the massive LED wall that swallowed nearly the entire back of the stage. Then the video began to play. The first clip showed Maggie's Brooklyn kitchen, filmed from the holy picture frame on the wall. Natasha stood in front of Maggie while Dominic had just stepped outside to take a call. Natasha's voice came through the grand ballroom sound system, crystal clear, icy, dripping with contempt. "You've learned to behave. Keep it up, and everything will be fine." 400 people stared at the screen. No one breathed. The second clip switched to the Midtown wedding planner's office, shot from Rosa's button camera. Natasha stood close to Maggie, eyes hard, voice sharp. "You're nothing but a dishwasher who got lucky her son made money. You don't belong at my wedding." Then Natasha's hand flew. The slap cracked through the speakers like a whip. Maggie's head snapped to the side. Her cheek flared red. She didn't say a word. She only rose and walked out with a dignity the entire ballroom was only now witnessing. Scattered sobs began to break through the room. Women covered their mouths. Men clenched their jaws. The third clip played Richard Kensington's voice on the phone, captured from Natasha's phone, on a night she'd been careless enough to use speaker, while Rosa was nearby. Richard said, "Good, don't rush. When you become his wife, everything our family lost will come back." In the ballroom, Richard Kensington, seated at table 3, in an expensive gray suit he'd borrowed, went as white as paper. He started to stand, but 2 of Tommy's guards were already behind him, as if they'd been there all along. Then the final clip played, the one that changed everything. The bridal prep room at the plaza a week earlier, recorded from Rosa's button camera through a half-open door. Natasha held her phone, voice relaxed and confident, as if she were speaking to a business partner instead of the deadliest enemy of the family she was about to marry into. "Pat, everything's on track. After the wedding, I'll have access to his schedule, his security detail, his accounts, everything you need." Then her voice went even lighter, almost amused. "He's in love. Blind, stupid love. And the old woman, she's taken care of." The name Patrick Donnelly hit the ballroom like someone had pulled the pin on a grenade. Allied bosses from Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago looked at one another. In the underworld, there is only one sin no one forgives, no one erases, no one forgets: betrayal. And Natasha Kensington hadn't just betrayed Dominic, she'd betrayed the entire alliance by selling information to Donnelly. The video stopped. The screen went dark. A lethal silence swallowed the grand ballroom. 400 people, including men who had watched death without blinking, sat perfectly still. Natasha stood in the middle of the room in her pure white wedding dress, her face whiter than the fabric. She turned left, turned right, her mouth moving without sound. She searched for an exit, but every door was already shut. Tommy had signaled the lockdown the instant the video began. No one in, no one out. Dominic stood 3 steps from Natasha. He hadn't moved through the entire playback. He stood like a statue, hands hanging at his sides, face drained of color. But his eyes, those dark gray eyes, weren't anger. Anger is loud, hot, explosive. What lived in Dominic's gaze now was colder than that, deeper than that, far more terrifying. It was destruction held under perfect control. He walked toward Natasha. Each step rang against marble in absolute silence. Natasha backed up. Her heels caught the leg of a table. She stumbled. "Dominic, baby, listen. Let me explain." Dominic stopped in front of her. His voice was low, heavy, each word falling slowly like bullets sliding into a magazine. You touched my mother. You hit the woman who took a beating that broke her ribs and never gave me up. You sold me to Donnelly, the son of the man who put that scar on her forehead. Natasha cried. Mascara streaked dark down her cheeks. It's not what you think. I can explain, please. Dominic turned his head toward Tommy. A single, small nod. Tommy signaled. 2 guards went to table 3, grabbed Richard Kensington by both arms, hauled him up, and forced him to his knees in front of Dominic. Richard shook violently, tears and mucus running, his voice breaking. Mr. Valente, please, I can explain. It was all her idea. I didn't know about Donnelly. Please. Dominic didn't look at Richard. He turned to face the 400 guests. His voice filled the ballroom without a microphone, because when Dominic Valente speaks, the world goes quiet to listen. This marriage is dead before it even began. There is no union, only the end of your lies. Today is the day everyone in this room witnesses that the Valente family does not forgive betrayal. He paused and drew a breath. Then his voice changed. Softer, lower, almost gentle. But today, I'm not going to kill anyone. The allied bosses looked at one another, stunned. In their world, betrayal means death. Because my mother taught me that real strength isn't taking a life. Real strength is knowing when to stop. Dominic turned his back on Natasha. He walked toward the last table near the kitchen door, where Maggie still stood, her face coated in frosting, her hair smeared with crumbs, her rosary stained. He stopped in front of her, and the most ruthless mafia boss in New York, the man the entire East Coast feared, slowly dropped to both knees on the marble floor, in front of 400 people, in front of allied families, politicians, businessmen, in front of the underworld itself. Dominic Valente knelt before a 63-year-old woman covered in cake, and his voice broke for the first time in his life. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I was blind. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry I let someone hit you and I didn't even know. Maggie looked down at her son kneeling at her feet. She lifted her calloused hands, still sticky with frosting, cupped Dominic's face, and raised it. She looked into his dark gray eyes, wet and red, and she said in the voice only a mother has, I forgive you, always. Dominic held her tight, as if he was afraid that if he let go she would vanish. Frosting smeared from Maggie's face onto his black suit, and he didn't care. 400 people stayed silent. Many of them cried. Rosa sobbed beside them. Tommy stood 3 steps away, eyes red, jaw clenched, but he didn't look away. He watched, because he needed to see this moment. Even the coldest bosses, the men who lived on ice because it was the only way to survive, lowered their heads. Natasha Kensington and Richard Kensington were thrown out of the plaza that very night. Natasha was still in her white wedding dress, black mascara smeared down her cheeks, her hair loose and wild, stepping through the hotel's front doors while dozens of contemptuous eyes burned into her back. Richard trailed behind her, his suit wrinkled, his face the color of ashes. Still babbling apologies no one cared to hear. 2 of Tommy's guards escorted them to the sidewalk, then stopped at the entrance with their arms crossed, watching father and daughter disappear into the Manhattan night with empty hands. From that night on, Dominic Valente destroyed them without spilling a single drop of blood. He didn't use a gun. He used a phone. In the first week after the wedding that never happened, Dominic ordered Franklin Gould to expose every detail of Richard Kensington's financial ruin to every creditor, every former partner, every bank he was still trying to charm into lending him money. $12 million in debt, 4 lawsuits waiting in the wings, assets that amounted to nothing. The information moved through New York finance in 3 days. No one loaned Richard Kensington a single cent after that. No one answered his calls. In the second week, Dominic shut every remaining door. Any restaurant, hotel, company, club in New York with ties to the Valente family, and the number was larger than anyone imagined, received one short message. The Kensington father and daughter were not welcome. No explanation was needed. In this world, when Dominic Valente says someone doesn't exist, they don't exist. Patrick Donnelly, the moment he heard Natasha had been exposed, reacted like an old Mafia hand would. He cut off all contact immediately. The prepaid phone Natasha used to text him was disabled within an hour of the video playing. Donnelly wasn't stupid. He knew the Valente family now had proof he'd been reaching into their business. And he also knew that Dominic, even after declaring he wouldn't kill anyone at the wedding, didn't mean he wouldn't kill someone after the wedding. Donnelly slipped back into the dark, stayed silent, and hoped the storm would pass. Natasha had to leave New York. No one in the city would accept her. Her high society friends, the same women who had laughed with her when she mocked Maggie in the bridal boutique, now didn't answer a single message. Her number was blocked, one contact at a time, as if she were a disease. She and Richard moved into her grandmother's small house in a quiet Connecticut town, an old place with mildew in the corners, wooden floors that groaned, miles away from Manhattan's lights. From a woman who dreamed of living on top of the world, Natasha Kensington became no one. Completely no one. But Dominic paid a price too. In the underworld, what happened at the wedding wasn't only a personal scandal, it was a sign of weakness. A boss who lets an enemy plant someone in his bed for 6 months without noticing is a fatal crack. Some allied families started to doubt. A boss in Philadelphia called Tommy and asked him outright if Valente still had control. A boss in Boston quietly increased the distance, not breaking the alliance, but no longer leaning in. Tommy worked himself ragged, repairing the damage. He flew back and forth between cities, held private meetings, gave assurances, made promises, and quietly proved the Valente family was still solid. Dominic knew all of it, but in the first weeks after the wedding that never happened, he didn't care about underworld politics. He went back to Brooklyn every Sunday. He sat in the old kitchen chair at Maggie's table, ate the pasta she needed from the morning, drank thick Italian black coffee, and didn't say much. Sometimes the two of them just sat in the rose garden behind the house while Maggie watered the flowers and Dominic watched, and the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was warm, as if they were slowly stitching shut the tears Natasha had left behind. Dominic changed, not in a dramatic or sudden way, but gradually, the way winter turns into spring in New York. He grew more reflective, he listened more, and every time he saw the scar on his mother's forehead, he didn't clench his jaw anymore. He simply lifted his hand, touched the scar lightly, and said, "I'm sorry, Mom," and Maggie always answered the same way. "You don't need to apologize. You're here. That's enough." 6 months after the wedding that never happened at the plaza, Dominic took Maggie to a community center in Brooklyn, only a few blocks from her house. She didn't understand why he brought her there until she saw the sign above the front doors, the Maggie Valente Fund. She stopped, stared at the sign, then looked at her son. Dominic held her hand. "This is a fund in your name. It supports immigrant women and single mothers. Microloans to open small shops, vocational training, childcare, and mental health support. So no woman has to go through what you went through with no one to help her." The opening ceremony was simple but warm. Dozens of immigrant women came, many holding small children. Maggie stood at the microphone with her rosary clenched in her hand, her voice trembling but clear, and she spoke in English threaded with the Sicilian accent she never tried to hide. "I had nothing when I came to this country, only 2 hands and faith, and those 2 things were enough for me to raise my son into a man. I hope this fund will show you that 2 hands and faith can be enough for you too." Dominic stood beside his mother, holding her hand, and he spoke to the crowd in a voice he'd never used in any business meeting or underworld negotiation, the voice of a son proud of his mother. "This fund exists because my mother taught me that dignity isn't measured by money, it's measured by character. She worked her whole life with her hands, so I could have a chance. And now other women will have the same chance." But the story wasn't over, because the biggest surprise was about to happen, something no one, not even Maggie, could have seen coming. 3 months after the fund's opening, on a light, rainy afternoon in Brooklyn, Gianna Whitfield stepped through the community center doors with a canvas bag on her shoulder and a thin folder tucked in her hand. She was 27, brown hair pulled into a simple ponytail, no makeup, wearing old jeans faded at the knees, and a clean white shirt worn soft at the cuffs. Her sneakers had a small tear at the toe she'd stitched closed with white thread. She looked so plain she was almost invisible in a crowd, but there was something in her that made people look twice. Her eyes were big and brown, warm, yet carrying a deep sadness behind them, the kind of sadness you see in someone who has lost too much too early and learned not to expect anything from life. Gianna Whitfield had been orphaned at 12. Her parents died in an apartment fire in the Bronx on a January night, when the alarm system failed and the fire escape was chained shut because the landlord was too cheap to fix it. 23 people died that night, including her mother and father. Gianna survived because she had been sleeping at her grandmother's house. Her grandmother was an elderly Puerto Rican woman who worked as a housekeeper for 3 families on the Upper West Side. She raised Gianna on a thin paycheck until lung cancer took her when Gianna was 14. After that, Gianna fell into the foster care system. The first foster family treated her like an unpaid maid. The second was worse. The foster father drank and beat her with a belt. The scars from those beatings still lived on her back, thin white lines crossing and recrossing, and she always hid them under long sleeves, even in summer. At 16, Gianna ran. She lived on New York streets for nearly 2 years, sleeping in shelters, eating at soup kitchens, taking any job that paid something, washing dishes, handing out flyers, cleaning. She taught herself for a GED at the public library, reading every night under streetlights, and her only dream was to open a small shop that sold baked goods and flowers together, because the smell of butter in an oven and the scent of fresh blooms were the only 2 things that could pull her back to childhood when her parents were still alive. Now she worked at a small bakery in Brooklyn, earning enough to cover a rented room and food, and on weekends she sold bouquets she arranged herself at a flea market. The file she submitted to the fund asked for startup support to open a tiny storefront that would sell both pastries and flowers, a place she planned to name Flower and Bloom. When Gianna presented her project to the fund's review board, Dominic was there. He sat in the back row, watching in silence. And as Gianna spoke, as she described her small dream in a voice that trembled slightly, yet stayed full of passion, as her eyes brightened for the first time because she was talking about the one thing she truly loved, Dominic felt something in his chest he'd thought had died after Natasha. Not fascination, not the hunger to possess, pure admiration. This girl had nothing. No money, no power, no connections, but she had what Natasha never had: sincerity. Maggie sat beside Dominic and saw the look on her son's face. This time she wasn't afraid, because that look was different. It wasn't the blind obsession she'd seen with Natasha. It was the tremor of a heart slowly waking after a long winter sleep. Gianna's project was approved. Dominic volunteered to visit the bakery where she worked, saying it was to better understand how the fund supported recipients. But the truth was he wanted to see her again. In the months that followed, Dominic came to the bakery a few times a week, sat at a small table by the window, drank black coffee, and talked with Gianna. He didn't bring bodyguards inside. He didn't drive the Bentley. He didn't wear a suit. He came in a t-shirt and jeans, walked in on foot, and sat there like an ordinary customer. Gianna knew who Dominic was. She had grown up on the streets. She knew the underworld, and she was afraid. She kept her distance, polite but guarded. Dominic didn't push. He was patient. He listened, and he never showed off anything. Then one night, close to midnight, as Gianna was cleaning the shop alone, 3 drunk thugs shoved their way in, harassed her, slammed tables, kicked chairs. Gianna backed into the kitchen corner with a broom gripped in both hands, her heart choking in her throat. Then the front door opened. Dominic stepped in. He didn't shout. He didn't pull a weapon. He only stood in the doorway, looked at the 3 men with those dark gray eyes, and said one sentence. "You've got 3 seconds to get out." They looked at Dominic, met his eyes, and they ran. Gianna stayed in the kitchen corner, still holding the broom, and for the first time in her life she felt safe. A month later, Dominic brought Gianna to Maggie's house on a Sunday. Maggie had been tense all morning, her hands shaking as she kneaded pasta dough, because after Natasha she didn't dare trust any woman who came near her son. Gianna stepped inside, and the first thing she did was hug Maggie. A tight hug, a long hug, a hug like she was holding the grandmother she'd lost. "Mrs. Maggie, it's an honor to meet you. Dominic talks about you so much. I feel like I've known you for a long time. You're an inspiration to me." The hug was sincere. Maggie felt the difference instantly. No stiff body, no polite little pats on the back, no false smile. Gianna held her with her whole heart. The meal was nothing like the first time Natasha came. Gianna ate 2 servings of pasta and praised it with real enthusiasm, her eyes lighting up when she tasted the tomato sauce. "Mrs. Maggie, this sauce is exactly like the sauce my mom used to make. This smell, slow-cooked tomatoes with garlic and fresh basil. This is the happiest memory I've got left." She asked for the tiramisu recipe. She spoke about her parents dying in the fire, about her grandmother working as a housekeeper to raise her, about foster care in the streets. She told it without self-pity, without begging for sympathy, only as a piece of her life she had accepted and walked through. After the meal, Dominic washed dishes while Gianna helped Maggie clear the table. Gianna spoke softly, straightforward with not a trace of calculation. "Mrs. Maggie, I want you to know, I don't care about Dominic's money or power. Honestly, those things scare me. But I see his heart when he talks about you, and that heart, I love it. I only have a small bakery dream and working hands, but they're mine, and I'm proud of them." Maggie took Gianna's hand and felt her skin, calloused, rough, cracked, just like her own. She looked into Gianna's eyes and said, "I believe you, my girl. I see the truth in your eyes." Then Gianna noticed the scar on Maggie's forehead. Her eyes filled. She didn't ask where it came from. She only lifted her hand and touched it gently with her fingertip, as if she understood. Because she had scars too, not on her forehead, but on her back, hidden beneath long sleeves. The two women looked at each other in that moment, and they didn't need more words. They understood each other in a language only people who have suffered too much ever learn to speak. 10 months after meeting Gianna Whitfield, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in Brooklyn, everything had changed. Not in the loud, violent way the underworld operates, but gently, slowly, the way Maggie's white roses open every spring. Dominic arrived at his mother's house earlier than usual that day. Gianna was already there, helping Maggie knead dough in the kitchen, the two women laughing as their hands turned white with flour, the smell of tomato sauce bubbling on the stove filling the whole house. Dominic stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, watching them, and his heart, the heart he'd once thought had hardened forever from blood and violence, beat softly and warmly in a way he didn't think he could feel anymore. The meal unfolded like any other Sunday. Fresh pasta, tomato sauce, roast chicken, tiramisu. Gianna ate 2 servings, Dominic ate 3, and Maggie watched her 2 kids eat without needing to serve them more because she was full on happiness alone. Then, in the middle of the meal, Dominic set down his fork, looked at Gianna, looked at his mother, and said, "I'm going to step outside for a moment." He stood and walked into the living room. Maggie followed him with her eyes, and she knew immediately. Her heart started beating faster. Dominic returned holding a small black velvet box. Not a large velvet case stamped with a famous jeweler's logo. A small box, simple, modest. He stood in front of Gianna, and the most feared Mafia boss in New York, the man the entire East Coast was afraid of, lowered himself to one knee on the old wooden floor in his mother's humble living room. There was no photographer, no music, no cameras, no 400 guests, only 3 people in an old Brooklyn house, the smell of tiramisu drifting from the kitchen, and late afternoon sunlight spilling through the window onto Gianna's stunned face. Dominic opened the box. Inside was a simple ring, white gold, not a 6-carat diamond, not platinum set with jewels, just a clean, elegant circle, engraved on the inside with 4 Italian words, La Via di Casa, the way home. "Gianna, you taught me what real love is. You taught me happiness isn't in power or money. It's in the people you're willing to share your life with. You make me want to be better every day. You're my way home. Marry me," Gianna cried. Tears ran down her cheeks, but those warm brown eyes were blazing, brighter than any diamond. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Maggie sat at the table with her rosary clenched in her hand, tears sliding down her wrinkled cheeks. But this time, for the first time in a long while, they were tears of pure happiness. 6 months later, the wedding happened. And it was nothing like the wedding at the plaza. There was no glittering grand ballroom, no 400 guests, no flowers flown in from the Netherlands, no $50,000 gown, no 2-tier cake on a crystal pedestal. The wedding was held in the garden behind Maggie's Brooklyn house, among the white rose bushes Giovanni had planted more than 40 years earlier. 50 people. Only 50. The ones who mattered most. Rosa was there, crying from beginning to end. Tommy stood beside Dominic as best man, wearing a suit for the first time in his life without a gun tucked inside. Franklin Gould sat in the second row, smiling. And Maggie, Margaret Valente, 64, stood beside Gianna as matron of honor, wearing the pale blue dress Gianna had chosen for her, holding a bouquet of white roses from the backyard. When it was time to speak, Maggie rose slowly, her legs no longer quick the way they once were, but steady. She looked around the small garden, at 50 beloved faces, and then she spoke in a voice that trembled, yet every word rang clear as a church bell on Sunday morning. "A year and a half ago, I lived through the most humiliating moment of my life. I was looked down on, I was hit, I was shamed. and all of it made me ask myself if I had any worth, if I was good enough. But today I understand that everything that happened wasn't about me. It was to expose who truly has character and who doesn't. And in the end, the truth always wins. Always. She looked at Dominic and Gianna, their hands clasped together. My son learned the hardest lesson of his life. Not everything that shines is gold, and sometimes the greatest wealth is found in the simplest things, in sincere love, in family, in honesty. She raised her glass, to my son and my daughter-in-law, who chose the road of truth. May you always be happy. Warm applause rose through the small garden. Dominic stepped forward and wrapped his mother in a long, tight embrace, and whispered in her ear, "Thank you, Mom, for never giving up on me." Maggie hugged him back, her voice gentle but firm. Never, never. That night, while the small celebration carried on with soft Italian music from an old speaker, real laughter, the scent of tiramisu and white roses braided together in the cool Brooklyn air, Tommy stood in the corner of the yard, with his back against the wooden fence, watching. He watched Dominic dance with Gianna on the grass, awkward, clumsy, laughing like a kid, nothing like Valente's boss at all. Tommy pulled out his phone and called the head of security. "Lower the security level. Boss is home. Everything's fine." He hung up, looked up at the Brooklyn night sky, and for the first time in 14 years at Dominic Valente's side, Tommy saw his boss truly at peace. Dominic stopped dancing and glanced over at Gianna, laughing with Maggie at the table, the two women holding hands, leaning their heads close, and he realized something it had taken him a lifetime to learn. Real power isn't controlling a city. It isn't making people afraid. It isn't money or guns. Real power is having someone to love and being loved back. And Maggie, Margaret Valente, the Sicilian immigrant woman with calloused hands and a scar on her forehead, sat in the white rose garden her late husband had left behind, looked around, and understood she had won. Not because Natasha had been exposed, not because the truth had been revealed. She had won because she never lost herself. She never let cruelty turn her into a cruel person. She never bowed her head, not even when wedding cake covered her face in front of 400 people. Because in the end, goodness defeats evil, truth outlasts lies, and sincere love breaks falsehood every time. Every tear, every insult, every painful moment had been worth it, because in the end, love had won. And that's the lesson this story offers everyone listening. No matter how hard life shoves you into a corner, no matter how you're mocked, knocked down, told you're not worthy, remember that true dignity can't be taken from you unless you hand it away. Live like Maggie, strong without violence, resilient without losing tenderness, and always believing the truth will find its way into the light, no matter how long it's buried. If this story touched your heart, please like, share this video with someone you love, and subscribe so you can listen with us to more meaningful stories every day. We'd truly love to know how you felt after hearing Maggie and Dominic's story. Have you ever faced something similar in real life? Have you ever had to choose between staying silent and speaking up? Write your feelings in the comments. We read every single one, and we always want to hear the voice that comes from the deepest part of your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for being here and for listening. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.